Have you ever stood at the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza and felt impossibly small? Not just small in the way that makes you appreciate human achievement, but small in a way that makes you question whether humans could have achieved it at all. Picture this. You're staring up at 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons, stacked with mathematical precision that modern engineers still struggle to replicate. The base covers 13 acres. The entire structure weighs roughly 6 million tons, and according to mainstream archaeology, it was built by people using copper tools, wooden ramps, and sheer determination. But what if I told you there's another explanation hiding in plain sight? What if the monuments we call ancient weren't built by ordinary humans at all, but by beings whose very existence has been systematically erased from our history books? Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most controversial theories in alternative archaeology, the idea that giants, not humans, were the master builders of antiquity. And before you click away thinking this is just another conspiracy video, I want you to consider something. Every culture on Earth, separated by oceans and millennia, tells the same story. Tales of enormous beings who shaped the landscape, moved mountains, and built structures so massive that only gods could have created them. The Nephilim of Hebrew scripture, the Titans of Greek mythology, the Anunnaki of Sumerian texts, the Quinametzin of Aztec lore. Different names, different continents, but the same impossible beings appearing again and again in humanity's oldest stories. I'm going to take you on a journey through archaeological sites that mainstream science struggles to explain, through ancient texts that describe construction methods involving beings of extraordinary size and strength, and through evidence that suggests our ancestors weren't just telling stories when they carved images of giants into stone. We're going to examine why certain monuments display engineering capabilities that seem impossibly advanced for their supposed time periods, and why so many ancient structures share design elements that could only have been implemented by builders working from the same incredible physical template. But here's what makes this investigation truly compelling. It's not just about the past. If giants really did build these monuments, then everything we think we know about human civilization, about our capabilities, about our place in history, needs to be completely rewritten. And the implications go far beyond archaeology. They touch on questions of human origins, suppressed knowledge, and whether we're actually the first advanced civilization on this planet. Over the next hour, I'm going to reveal 8 pieces of evidence that suggest giant builders were responsible for humanity's most mysterious monuments. We'll explore construction techniques that required superhuman strength, analyze ancient accounts of giant architects, and examine physical evidence that mainstream archaeology either ignores or explains away. You'll see measurements and proportions that only make sense when scaled to beings much larger than humans, and discover why so many ancient sites share identical construction methods despite being separated by thousands of miles and supposedly thousands of years. This isn't about proving every tall tale or validating every fringe theory. This is about following the evidence wherever it leads, even when it challenges everything we've been taught about our past. Because if we're wrong about who built these monuments, we might be wrong about a lot more than we realize. Let's start with something that should be impossible: the precision. When you examine the Great Pyramid, you're not just looking at an impressive pile of stones. You're looking at a structure aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60th of a degree. That's more precise than the Greenwich Observatory built in the 1800s. The base is level to within just 2.1 centimeters across its entire 230-meter span. The mathematical relationships encoded in its dimensions include pi, the golden ratio, and measurements that correspond to the Earth's circumference and the speed of light. But here's what really makes you stop and think. The pyramid contains stones that were quarried from sites over 500 miles away. These aren't small decorative pieces. We're talking about granite blocks weighing 50 to 80 tons, transported across hundreds of miles of desert and river, then lifted hundreds of feet into the air and placed with millimeter precision. The mainstream explanation involves ramps, ropes, and thousands of workers. But the mathematics don't add up. To build the Great Pyramid in the 20 years traditionally assigned to its construction, workers would have had to cut, transport, and precisely place one 2.5-ton block every 2 minutes, working 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. That's assuming they never stopped to eat, sleep, or deal with the logistics of managing what would have been the largest construction project in human history. And that's just one pyramid. Egypt alone contains over 100 pyramids, not counting the countless temples, obelisks, and other megalithic structures scattered throughout the Nile Valley. When you expand your view globally, the numbers become even more staggering. Peru has over 100,000 archaeological sites. Easter Island has nearly 1,000 massive stone statues. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey consists of at least 20 circular structures, each requiring the movement and precise placement of stones weighing up to 16 tons. But it's not just the scale that's problematic for conventional archaeology. It's the techniques. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, you'll find stone blocks cut with such precision that they fit together like Lego pieces. No mortar needed. The tolerances are tighter than what modern machinery typically achieves. The surfaces are so smooth and flat that you can't slip a piece of paper between the joints. And these aren't soft stones. We're talking about granite and diorite, materials that rank 6 to 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. According to mainstream archaeology, these cuts were made with copper and bronze tools, along with stone hammers and wooden wedges. But here's the problem. Copper ranks 2.5 to 3 on the Mohs scale. Bronze is only slightly harder. You cannot cut granite with copper any more than you can cut steel with butter. Yet somehow, ancient builders achieved precision that requires diamond-tipped tools and computer-guided machinery. The same impossible precision appears at sites around the world. In Egypt, the granite boxes in the Serapeum of Saqqara are cut to tolerances of 0.0002 inches. That's within the range of modern precision grinding. At Ollantaytambo in Peru, massive pink granite blocks are fitted together so perfectly that archaeologists initially thought they were carved from a single piece of stone. Only close examination revealed the individual blocks, joined with precision that defies explanation. This level of craftsmanship appears consistently across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. The H-blocks at Pumapunku match construction techniques found at sites in Egypt, Easter Island, and Japan. The polygonal masonry of Cusco mirrors similar work found in Lebanon, Turkey, and Italy. Either there was a global civilization with shared technology that mainstream archaeology has completely missed, or these sites were built by the same builders. And this is where the giant hypothesis begins to make sense. Because when you examine these monuments not as products of human civilization, but as works scaled to beings of extraordinary size and strength, the impossible becomes merely improbable. Consider the doorways. At sites throughout Peru, you'll find entrances that are 12, 15, even 20 feet tall. The lintels above these doorways are single pieces of stone weighing 10 to 20 tons. Mainstream archaeology explains these as ceremonial entrances, built tall to impress visitors. But why make doors so large that you need ladders to reach the handles? Why design every entrance in a complex for beings twice the height of normal humans if normal humans were the builders? The same oversized proportions appear globally. The trilithons at Stonehenge stand 24 feet high, with horizontal lintels weighing 50 tons placed precisely on top of vertical posts. The Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek contains stones weighing over 800 tons, moved into position 20 feet above ground level. The colossal heads on Easter Island average 13 feet in height and weigh 14 tons each, but that's just the heads. Recent excavations revealed that these statues have bodies extending 30 feet underground. making the complete figures nearly 40 feet tall. These aren't isolated examples. They're part of a global pattern of construction that consistently exceeds human scale. And when ancient texts describe the builders of these monuments, they don't describe humans at all. The Book of Enoch states that the Nephilim were 300 cubits tall. That's roughly 450 feet, which sounds fantastical until you realize that ancient texts often used symbolic rather than literal measurements. But even if we scale this down dramatically, we're still talking about beings significantly larger than modern humans. The Dead Sea Scrolls describe giants who were 3,000 ells tall, and while these measurements are likely exaggerated, they consistently point to builders of extraordinary size. Greek historians like Pausanias wrote about discovering the bones of ancient heroes, describing skeletal remains that were far larger than contemporary humans. Flavius Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, claimed that giants' bones were still being discovered in his time, displayed as curiosities and proof of the ancient accounts. But you don't have to rely on ancient texts. Archaeological evidence of oversized human remains appears consistently in historical records, though it's often dismissed or explained away by modern science. Throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, newspapers regularly reported the discovery of giant skeletons across North America. The Smithsonian Institution was frequently mentioned as the repository for these remains, though most have since disappeared from public view. In 1912, archaeologists discovered a cemetery near Lovelock Cave in Nevada, containing skeletons measuring between 8 and 10 feet in length. The remains were described as having red hair and being preserved due to the dry cave conditions. Similar discoveries were reported from Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, and dozens of other states, always with the same characteristics: extraordinary height, robust bone structure, and often accompanied by oversized tools and weapons. Modern anthropology explains these reports as misidentification, hoaxes, or exaggeration. But the consistency of the accounts, spanning different regions and time periods, suggests something more systematic than random error. And this brings us to one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for giant builders: the tools themselves. At archaeological sites around the world, you'll find tools that are simply too large for human hands. Hammers with handles designed for grips twice the size of normal human hands. Stone axes that would require superhuman strength just to lift, let alone use effectively. In the Nazca region of Peru, archaeologists have discovered copper and bronze implements that are so oversized they've been classified as ceremonial objects because no human could practically wield them. But what if they weren't ceremonial at all? What if they were simply tools built for hands and bodies much larger than ours? The same pattern emerges when you examine the construction marks left on ancient stone blocks. At sites like Ollantaytambo and Sacsayhuaman, you can see chisel marks and tool impressions that are far too large to have been made by human-sized implements. The spacing between parallel chisel marks suggests tools operated by beings with arm spans and grip strength far exceeding human capabilities. This isn't speculation based on blurry photographs or questionable measurements. These are precise forensic observations that you can verify yourself by visiting these sites. The tool marks are there, preserved in stone, telling a story that challenges everything we think we know about who built these monuments. Now, let's talk about something even more revealing: the logistics of ancient construction projects. When mainstream archaeology attempts to explain how these monuments were built, they focus on the engineering challenges but rarely address the organizational complexity. Moving a single 800-ton stone from a quarry to a construction site would require coordination between thousands of workers. You need quarry teams, transport crews, road maintenance, food supply lines, tool manufacturing, and construction specialists. The logistics alone would require a level of social organization and communication that supposedly didn't exist in ancient times. But giants would fundamentally change this equation. A being with 10 times human strength wouldn't just be able to lift 10 times more weight. They'd be able to work with exponentially greater efficiency. Tasks that require hundreds of humans could be accomplished by a handful of giants. Complex logistics would become simple operations. Consider the Easter Island statues again. These aren't just large sculptures. They were carved from volcanic rock at a central quarry, then transported across the island to their final positions. Some traveled over 10 miles from the quarry to their destination. The traditional explanation involves hundreds of people using ropes and wooden rollers to move each statue over a period of months or years. But here's what's fascinating. Local legends describe the statues walking to their positions. For decades, archaeologists dismissed this as primitive mythology. Then, in recent experiments, researchers discovered that the statues could indeed be walked upright using a coordinated rocking motion. But this technique would still require dozens of people and extremely precise coordination. Unless, of course, the statues were moved by beings large enough and strong enough to manipulate them directly. Beings who could literally walk the statues to their positions without requiring armies of human workers. This brings us to one of the most overlooked aspects of the giant builder hypothesis, the time factor. Archaeological dating methods assign construction periods that span decades or centuries to these monuments. The Great Pyramid supposedly took 20 years to build. Angkor Wat required over 30 years. Borobudur in Indonesia took 75 years to complete. These timeframes are based on calculations assuming human-scale workers using primitive tools and techniques. But what if the builders weren't human-scale at all? Giants with superhuman strength and advanced tools could have completed these projects in a fraction of the time. What appears to be decades of human labor could represent just a few years of giant construction. This would explain why so many megalithic sites seem to have been built in coordinated waves, with similar techniques appearing simultaneously across vast distances. It would also explain something that has puzzled archaeologists for decades: the apparent lack of evolutionary development in ancient construction techniques. When you examine megalithic sites, you don't see gradual improvement over time. Instead, you see full-blown mastery appearing suddenly, as if the builders already possessed complete knowledge of advanced engineering principles. Human civilizations develop technology incrementally. We see this in every field, from pottery to metallurgy to architecture. Skills improve gradually as knowledge accumulates across generations. But megalithic construction appears to have emerged fully formed, with no learning curve visible in the archaeological record. This makes perfect sense if the builders weren't learning these techniques through trial and error. If giants with existing knowledge and capabilities simply applied their skills to construction projects around the world. Now, let's examine something that might be the most compelling evidence of all: the consistent proportions. When architects and engineers design buildings, they use proportional systems based on human measurements. Doorways are sized for human passage. Staircases are built for human stride lengths. Rooms are scaled to human occupancy. These proportions are so fundamental to human architecture that they're encoded in building standards worldwide. But ancient megalithic sites consistently violate these proportions. At Newgrange in Ireland, the passage tomb contains corridors that are 19 feet high but only 3 feet wide. A human walking through this passage would feel like they're moving through a giant's hallway, which is exactly what they might be doing. The proportions make perfect sense if the builders were significantly taller than modern humans. The same disproportionate scaling appears at sites worldwide. The inner chambers of the Great Pyramid contain spaces that are far too large for practical human use, but would be perfectly proportioned for beings 12 to 15 feet tall. The megalithic temples of Malta have doorways, rooms, and altars that are consistently oversized for human occupation. This isn't accidental. These proportions are too consistent and too widespread to be coincidental. They represent a systematic architectural approach based on the physical dimensions of the builders themselves. And here's where it gets really interesting. When you analyze the mathematical relationships in these monuments using giant proportions rather than human measurements, everything clicks into place. The Great Pyramid's internal chamber dimensions, when scaled to a 2 foot tall builder, align perfectly with human anatomical proportions. The king's chamber becomes a room sized for a giant's comfort rather than a space that dwarfs human occupants. The passageways become corridors designed for beings moving with giant stride lengths rather than cramped tunnels that force humans to crawl. The same proportional harmony emerges at other sites when you apply giant scaling. Stonehenge's trilithons create spaces perfectly proportioned for 5-foot-tall gatherings. The Easter Island statues represent portrait sculptures at natural scale for their creators. The massive doorways at Pumapunku become normal entrances rather than ceremonial monuments. This proportional evidence is mathematical and verifiable. It doesn't rely on ancient texts or controversial interpretations. It's pure architectural analysis that reveals a construction system based on builders significantly larger than modern humans. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the giant builder hypothesis is what it suggests about the relationship between these ancient constructors and humanity itself. Because if giants built these monuments, they didn't build them for themselves, they built them for us. Think about it. Every megalithic site on Earth is associated with human civilization. These monuments became the focal points of human cultures, the centers of human religious and social activity. The pyramids weren't just giant tombs. They were the heart of Egyptian civilization. Stonehenge wasn't just a giant calendar. It was central to British prehistoric culture. Angkor Wat wasn't just a massive temple. It was the capital of the Khmer Empire. Why would giants build monuments that would become central to human societies? Why would beings of such power and capability create structures that humans would inherit and venerate? The answer might lie in the relationship between giants and humans described in ancient texts worldwide. These accounts don't just describe giants as separate beings. They describe interactions, relationships, and often conflicts between giants and humans. They tell stories of giants teaching humans various skills, including architecture and engineering. What if the megalithic monuments weren't just built by giants, but built by giants specifically for human civilizations that would come after them? What if these structures represent a form of inheritance, a legacy left by an earlier phase of intelligent life on Earth? This possibility transforms how we understand these monuments. They weren't just impressive construction projects. They were gifts, teaching tools, or perhaps even warnings left by beings who understood they wouldn't remain on Earth forever. And if that's true, then studying these monuments isn't just archaeology. It's communication with intelligences that preceded us, encoded messages left in stone for us to discover when we finally developed the knowledge to understand what we were seeing. The implications are staggering. Because if giants really did build these monuments as legacies for humanity, then somewhere in their construction, in their proportions, in their mathematical relationships, there might be information we're still meant to discover. Knowledge that could transform our understanding not just of the past, but of our own capabilities and potential. This possibility leads us to examine something that mainstream archaeology has never adequately addressed: the sudden appearance of advanced civilizations with no apparent developmental period. Look at Sumer, often called the cradle of civilization. According to conventional history, humans went from hunter-gatherers to sophisticated city builders practically overnight in historical terms. Suddenly, around 3,500 BCE, we see the emergence of writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, and complex social structures. Not gradually developed over millennia, but appearing fully formed as if someone had flipped a switch. The Sumerian texts themselves describe this transition, but not as human innovation. They describe the Anunnaki, beings of great stature and knowledge, teaching humans these skills directly. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Enkidu as being so tall that when he stood in the river, the water only reached his waist. The Sumerian king list mentions rulers with impossibly long lifespans, suggesting they weren't entirely human. But here's what's truly remarkable. When you examine the proportions of Sumerian architecture, the same giant scaling appears. The ziggurats weren't just tall buildings. They were structures with steps, doorways, and chambers sized for beings much larger than humans. The famous Standard of Ur depicts figures of varying heights, with some individuals shown as giants compared to normal humans, suggesting this size difference wasn't just artistic license, but reflected actual relationships between different types of beings. The same pattern emerges across every ancient civilization. The Olmecs of Mesoamerica left colossal head sculptures weighing up to 50 tons, depicting faces with features that don't match local populations. These heads are so massive that moving them from their basalt quarries to their final locations would have required sophisticated engineering. Yet mainstream archaeology insists they were carved and transported by people using stone tools and human labor. But examine the facial proportions on these heads. They're not stylized human faces enlarged to monumental scale. They maintain anatomically correct proportions that suggest they were portraits of actual individuals. Individuals whose heads would have been roughly 6 feet tall, implying total body heights of 30 to 40 feet. The Olmec site of Levanta contains additional evidence that challenges conventional explanations. Buried beneath later construction, archaeologists discovered massive stone heads that were apparently intentionally interred. Why would a civilization go to enormous effort to create these monuments, then deliberately bury them? Unless they weren't burying monuments at all, but graves. Graves of the actual giants these heads represented. This practice of burying giant remains appears consistently across ancient cultures. The mound-building civilizations of North America created earthworks that require enormous labor to construct, yet contain burial chambers sized for individuals, much larger than typical Native Americans. The Cahokia site alone contains over 80 mounds, some reaching heights of 100 feet and covering areas of 14 acres. When early European settlers excavated these mounds, they consistently reported finding skeletal remains of extraordinary size. The accounts are so numerous and consistent that dismissing them all as hoaxes or misidentifications becomes statistically impossible. Major newspapers from the 1800s contain hundreds of reports from credible sources, including doctors, professors, and government officials, all describing the same phenomenon. In 1883, the Smithsonian published a report describing the discovery of several giant skeletons in West Virginia, measuring between 7 and 9 feet in length. In 1894, archaeologists working in Ohio reported finding a cemetery containing over 100 skeletons, all measuring over 8 feet tall. In 1912, ranchers in Nevada discovered naturally mummified remains of red-haired giants in Lovelock Cave, some reaching heights of nearly 10 feet. These discoveries weren't made by amateur treasure hunters or sensationalist journalists. They were documented by professional archaeologists, published in scientific journals, and reported by mainstream newspapers as legitimate archaeological finds. Yet today, these reports are either ignored entirely or dismissed as products of poor measurement techniques and overactive imaginations. But what if they weren't mistakes at all? What if these discoveries represent physical evidence of the giants described in ancient texts and depicted in megalithic art worldwide? The implications extend far beyond archaeology. Because if giants really existed as a distinct population, their disappearance raises profound questions about what happened to them and why evidence of their existence has been systematically suppressed. Ancient texts provide some clues. The Book of Enoch describes a great conflict between giants and humans, ultimately resulting in a divine intervention that removed the giants from Earth. The Greek Titanomachy tells of a war between the Titans and the Olympians, ending with the Titans being imprisoned beneath the earth. Hindu texts describe similar conflicts between races of giants and gods, with the giants ultimately being defeated and banished. These aren't just mythological stories. They're remarkably consistent accounts from cultures separated by continents and millennia, all describing the same basic narrative. Giants once coexisted with humans, conflicts arose, and the giants were ultimately eliminated or removed. What if these texts preserve historical memories rather than mythological fantasies? What if humanity's ancestors actually witnessed the disappearance of a giant population and encoded these memories in their most sacred stories? This possibility gains credibility when you examine the archaeological record more carefully, because while evidence of giant populations has been systematically downplayed or ignored, evidence of sudden, catastrophic events appears consistently throughout human prehistory. The Younger Dryas period, roughly 12,800 years ago, marked a sudden return to Ice Age conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. This climatic catastrophe coincided with the extinction of numerous large animal species and the apparent disappearance of advanced human cultures like the Clovis people in North America. But what's particularly intriguing is that this period also marks the end of megalithic construction in many regions. The last Great Pyramids were built around this time. The final phases of Göbekli Tepe were deliberately buried around 10,000 BCE. Many of the world's most impressive stone circles and megalithic complexes show signs of abandonment during this same period. It's as if the builders of these monuments simply vanished from the archaeological record, leaving behind their incredible constructions but no clear descendants with the same capabilities. The timing is too consistent to be coincidental. A global catastrophe that eliminated megafauna, disrupted human civilizations, and ended the age of megalithic construction suggests a single cause that affected the entire planet simultaneously. Could this catastrophe have been specifically targeted at eliminating a population of giants while allowing smaller humans to survive? Recent research into the Younger Dryas event has revealed evidence of cosmic impacts that could have caused such selective destruction. Larger beings would have been more vulnerable to environmental changes, food scarcity, and direct impact damage. Meanwhile, smaller human populations could have survived in caves, underground shelters, and remote locations. This scenario aligns perfectly with ancient flood narratives found in cultures worldwide. The story of Noah's Ark, the Sumerian flood epic, the Hindu tale of Manu, the Greek account of Deucalion, and dozens of other flood traditions all describe the same basic story: a great catastrophe that destroyed giants and other large creatures while preserving smaller populations in specially prepared refuges. What's remarkable is that these stories consistently mention the elimination of giants as a specific goal of the flood. They weren't just caught up in a natural disaster. They were apparently targeted for removal. But here's where the evidence becomes truly compelling. Because if giants were eliminated around 12,800 years ago, it means the megalithic monuments we see today aren't thousands of years old, as mainstream archaeology claims. They're remnants of a pre-catastrophe civilization that possessed capabilities we've never equaled. This timeline resolves many of the contradictions in conventional archaeology. It explains why megalithic construction techniques appear fully developed with no learning curve. It explains why similar methods appear simultaneously across vast distances. It explains why these monuments seem impossibly advanced for their supposed time periods. They weren't built by the human civilizations we associate with them. They were inherited by those civilizations from builders who no longer existed. The Great Pyramid wasn't built by Khufu's workers around 2580 BCE. It was built by giants thousands of years earlier, and later claimed by Egyptian pharaohs who lacked the ability to construct such monuments themselves. Stonehenge wasn't erected by Neolithic Britons around 3100 BCE. It was built by pre-catastrophe giants and later adopted by human populations who moved into the area after the builders had vanished. This explains why these monuments often show signs of later human modification and repair using techniques that are clearly inferior to the original construction. The humans who inherited these sites recognized their importance but lacked the knowledge to maintain them properly. It also explains why so many megalithic sites contain evidence of multiple construction phases, with the earliest and most sophisticated work gradually giving way to cruder additions and repairs as human populations attempted to continue building in the same locations without understanding the original methods. At Göbekli Tepe, for example, the oldest layers contain the most sophisticated carving and construction. As you move up through successive layers, the quality steadily decreases until the final phase shows relatively primitive work before the entire site was deliberately buried. This pattern appears globally. At Angkor Wat, the central temple represents incredibly sophisticated construction, while later additions show declining technical capability. At Easter Island, the Moai statues show evidence of multiple phases, with the most precisely carved examples being the oldest. It's as if human populations were attempting to continue a building tradition they had inherited but didn't fully understand, resulting in steadily degrading quality over time until they finally abandoned the effort entirely. But if this interpretation is correct, it means we need to completely reconsider our understanding of human history and capabilities, because it suggests that our current technological civilization isn't the first advanced culture on Earth. It's actually a recovery civilization, slowly redeveloping capabilities that existed before the catastrophe that eliminated the giants. This perspective transforms how we view our own achievements. Technologies we consider cutting edge might actually be rediscoveries of principles that were known to pre-catastrophe civilizations. Mathematical relationships we've only recently decoded might have been common knowledge to the builders of megalithic monuments. The precision we achieve with computer-controlled machinery might pale in comparison to capabilities that giants possess naturally through their enhanced size, strength, and sensory abilities. And this brings us to perhaps the most profound implication of the giant builder hypothesis. If these beings really existed and really built the monuments we call ancient, then studying these structures isn't just archaeology, it's reverse engineering. Every measurement we take, every technique we analyze, every mathematical relationship we discover in these monuments is potentially a window into capabilities that far exceeded what we consider possible. The giants may be gone, but their knowledge is still here, in code to decode it. This possibility suggests in stone, waiting for us to develop the understanding necessary that the megaliths aren't just impressive ancient constructions, they're libraries. Repositories of advanced knowledge left by beings who understood they wouldn't survive the coming catastrophe, but wanted to preserve their achievements for whatever civilization might arise afterward. The mathematical constants encoded in the Great Pyramid's dimensions, the astronomical alignments built into Stonehenge, the acoustic properties of megalithic chambers around the world. These aren't coincidental features or primitive religious symbolism. They're information storage systems designed to preserve crucial knowledge in the most durable format possible, precisely cut stone. And if that's true, then we're not just studying ruins. We're attending a university built by giants, slowly learning lessons they intended us to discover when we finally developed the capability to understand what they were trying to teach us. The question is, are we ready for what we might learn? The answer might lie in something that mainstream archaeology has consistently overlooked. The tools found at megalithic sites aren't just oversized for human hands. They're designed with engineering principles that suggest their users possessed fundamentally different physical capabilities than modern humans. At Ollantaytambo in Peru, archaeologists have discovered granite hammers weighing over 200 pounds. These aren't ceremonial objects gathering dust in storage rooms. They show clear signs of use, with impact marks and wear patterns consistent with active construction work. But here's the problem. No human could effectively wield a 200-pound hammer. The physics simply don't work. You'd need the strength to lift it, the leverage to swing it, and the body mass to absorb the impact without being thrown backward. But for a being 15 feet tall with proportional strength, a 200-pound hammer would feel like a 20-pound sledgehammer feels to us. Perfectly manageable, ideally sized for precision stonework. And this scaling relationship appears consistently across megalithic sites worldwide. In the quarries of Aswan, Egypt, you'll find copper chisels that are 3 times the length of normal human tools, with grip sections designed for hands twice the size of human hands. At Baalbek in Lebanon, iron wedges discovered in construction debris are so large that archaeologists initially classified them as decorative objects because no human could possibly use them for their intended purpose. But perhaps the most revealing evidence comes from the stone blocks themselves. When you examine the chisel marks left on megalithic stones, you can calculate the size and strength of the tools that made them, the spacing between parallel cuts, the depth of individual strikes, the angle of approach required to achieve certain surface finishes. It's forensic engineering, and the results are consistent across every site. The tools that carved these blocks were operated by beings with arm spans averaging 12 to 15 feet. The grip strength required to control these implements would have been roughly 10 times that of a strong human. The body weight necessary to provide leverage for the heaviest tools suggests builders weighing 1,500 to 2,000 pounds. These aren't estimates based on mythology or ancient artwork. They're mathematical calculations derived from physical evidence that you can measure yourself. The stone doesn't lie. The tool marks don't exaggerate. They preserve an exact record of the capabilities possessed by whoever made them. And here's what makes this evidence even more compelling. The same dimensional relationships appear in the monument's architectural features. When engineers design staircases, they use formulas based on human anatomy. The average human step length, combined with comfortable rise heights, produces stairway proportions that feel natural to navigate. These proportions are so fundamental that they appear in construction standards worldwide. But megalithic sites consistently violate these proportions. The staircases at Angkor Wat have steps that are 18 inches high and 36 inches deep. For a human, climbing these stairs requires an awkward, exhausting gait that feels completely unnatural. But for a being twice human height, these proportions would create perfectly comfortable stairs. The same scaling appears at Borobudur in Indonesia, where the temple's terraced levels are accessed by staircases with step heights of 15 to 20 inches. At Chichen Itza, the main pyramid stairs are so steep and high that modern visitors often have to crawl up them on hands and knees. Yet these proportions would be perfectly natural for giants with longer legs and larger stride lengths. This isn't coincidental architectural preference. It's consistent evidence of builders who possess different physical dimensions than the humans who later used these structures. But the dimensional evidence goes even deeper. When you analyze the internal spaces of megalithic monuments, you discover room proportions that follow the same giant scaling. The King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid measures roughly 34 feet long, 17 feet wide, and 19 feet high. For human occupancy, these are bizarre proportions. The room feels cavernous and awkward, with no clear functional purpose. But when you scale these dimensions to a 2-foot-tall occupant, they create a perfectly proportioned bedroom. The length-to-width ratio matches ideal room proportions found in human architecture. The ceiling height provides comfortable headroom without feeling oppressive. The same proportional harmony appears when you apply giant scaling to other pyramid chambers. Passages that force humans to crawl become comfortable corridors for 12-foot beings. Chambers that dwarf human visitors become appropriately sized rooms for giant occupants. At Newgrange in Ireland, the passage tomb contains a chamber that's 20 feet high but only accessible through a tunnel that's 3 feet tall. Mainstream archaeology explains this as symbolic architecture, representing a journey from the earthly realm to the divine. But the proportions make perfect sense if the chamber was designed for 1 5-foot-tall beings who could comfortably stand inside, while the entrance tunnel provided security against smaller intruders. These aren't isolated examples. They represent a systematic architectural approach that appears at megalithic sites on every continent. Someone built these structures using proportional systems based on bodies much larger than modern humans. And this brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of the evidence: the consistency of the scaling relationships. If these monuments were built by different cultures at different times, as mainstream archaeology insists, you'd expect to see variation in the proportional systems used. Human cultures develop different architectural traditions based on local materials, climate, and cultural preferences. Roman architecture differs from Greek architecture, which differs from Egyptian architecture, even though these cultures interacted extensively. But megalithic monuments worldwide use virtually identical proportional relationships. The same dimensional ratios appear at sites separated by thousands of miles and supposedly thousands of years. This suggests either unprecedented cultural contact between ancient civilizations or construction by the same builders. The giant hypothesis explains this consistency perfectly. If the same population of giants built monuments worldwide using their own physical dimensions as the basis for proportional systems, you'd expect to see exactly the uniformity that appears in the archaeological record. But here's where the evidence becomes truly extraordinary. Because it's not just the proportions that are consistent worldwide. It's the construction techniques themselves. At megalithic sites on every continent, you'll find the same distinctive masonry style known as polygonal construction. Instead of using rectangular blocks like modern builders, the ancients cut stones into complex interlocking shapes that fit together like puzzle pieces. Each stone is unique, yet fits perfectly with its neighbors, without the need for mortar. This technique appears at Cusco in Peru, where granite blocks weighing several tons are fitted together with tolerances measured in fractions of inches. It appears at Delphi in Greece, where limestone blocks are cut into complex polygonal shapes that have withstood earthquakes for thousands of years. It appears in Japan, where megalithic walls use the same interlocking technique with volcanic stones. The precision required for this construction method is extraordinary. Each stone must be individually shaped to fit perfectly with multiple neighbors. The angles and curves must be calculated to distribute weight evenly across the structure. Modern architects avoid polygonal construction because it's incredibly complex and time-consuming, requiring advanced computer modeling and precision cutting equipment. Yet somehow, ancient builders used this technique routinely, achieving results that modern engineers struggle to replicate. The only logical explanation is that the builders possessed capabilities that made this difficult technique relatively simple to execute. Giants with enhanced strength could manipulate heavy stones as easily as humans handle small blocks. Giants with enhanced sensory capabilities could judge angles and fits with precision that exceeds human perception. Giants with longer lifespans could invest the time required to perfect techniques that would take human builders' entire careers to master. But perhaps the most convincing evidence comes from something that's been hiding in plain sight for centuries. The artistic depictions created by the civilizations that inherited these monuments. Throughout Egypt, you'll find hieroglyphic scenes showing humans working alongside beings of extraordinary height. These aren't stylized representations where size indicates importance, as mainstream archaeology claims. They're anatomically proportioned figures that maintain correct head-to-body ratios regardless of their overall size. In the tomb of Rekhmire, the vizier of Thutmosis III, wall paintings show construction workers of normal human size working under the supervision of beings who are depicted as twice their height. The giants are shown directing the placement of massive stones, their hands easily grasping blocks that require multiple humans to move. Similar depictions appear in Sumerian art, where cylinder seals show humans and giants working together on construction projects. The size differences are consistent and proportional, not symbolic. The giants are shown using tools that are scaled to their larger bodies, while humans use smaller implements appropriate to their size. At Angkor Wat, relief carvings depict the construction of the temple itself, showing workers of varying heights collaborating on different aspects of the project. The largest figures are shown handling the heaviest stones, while smaller figures work on detail carving and finishing work. These artistic records aren't mythological fantasy. They're documentary evidence created by cultures that had direct contact with giant builders. The consistency of these depictions across different civilizations suggests they were recording actual events, not imaginary scenes. And this documentary evidence extends beyond artwork into written records that mainstream archaeology has consistently misinterpreted. The Egyptian pyramid texts, among the oldest written records in human history, contain detailed descriptions of construction projects involving beings called the Neteru, usually translated as gods, but literally meaning the tall ones. These texts describe the Neteru as physically towering over humans, possessing strength that allowed them to move stones that required hundreds of men to lift. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh describes Enkidu as being so tall that when he stood in the river, the water only reached his waist. This isn't poetic exaggeration. The text provides specific measurements, stating that Enkidu was 11 cubits tall, roughly 16 feet. The epic describes him moving stones to build walls, working alongside human laborers who were amazed by his capabilities. Mayan codices describe the Quinametzin, giants who built the first cities and temples before being destroyed in a great flood. These texts provide specific details about construction techniques, describing how the giants could lift stones that no man could move and shape rock as if it were clay. Hindu texts are even more explicit. The Ramayana describes the construction of Lanka by the demon king Ravana, who is depicted as a giant with multiple heads and arms. The text explains that Ravana's size and strength allowed him to personally oversee construction projects that would have required armies of human workers. These aren't primitive creation myths. They're technical manuals describing construction techniques and capabilities that exceeded normal human limits. The consistency of these accounts across cultures that had no contact with each other suggests they were preserving historical memories rather than creating fictional stories. But perhaps the most compelling written evidence comes from sources that mainstream archaeology rarely examines: the construction logs and administrative records that ancient civilizations maintained for their building projects. Egyptian papyrus documents describe pyramid construction using terms that don't make sense when applied to human workers. Records refer to stones being lifted by single hands and moved without ropes or ramps. These descriptions are usually dismissed as religious metaphor, but what if they were literal accounts of giants working on construction sites? Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets contain similar references to construction work performed by beings with capabilities far exceeding human limits. Administrative records from Babylon describe temple construction where individual workers moved stones that required 10 men to lift, yet these same workers are listed as receiving single-person food rations. Roman historians like Pliny the Elder wrote about discovering construction sites where the tools and building materials were sized for beings much larger than humans. Pliny describes finding hammers and chisels in ancient quarries that were so large they had to be displayed as curiosities because no one could imagine how they might have been used. These historical accounts weren't written by primitive peoples prone to mythological thinking. They were created by sophisticated civilizations with advanced administrative systems and careful record-keeping practices. When they describe giants working on construction projects, they're reporting observations, not creating legends. And this documentation extends into more recent historical periods than most people realize. During the European exploration of the Americas, conquistadors and missionaries regularly encountered evidence of giant builders. Spanish chronicles describe finding tools, weapons, and skeletal remains of extraordinary size in regions where megalithic construction was prevalent. Hernán Cortés wrote to King Charles V, describing the discovery of bones of men who were giants in the temples of Tenochtitlan. He reported finding skulls as large as our heads and femur bones that were longer than a man is tall. These discoveries were made in the context of examining construction sites that contained stones too large for human builders to have moved. Francisco Pizarro's expedition to Peru resulted in similar reports. Spanish soldiers described finding giant skeletons in burial chambers beneath megalithic walls at Cusco and Ollantaytambo. The remains were described as being twice the height of the tallest Spaniards and associated with construction tools that were proportionally oversized. These weren't isolated reports from unreliable sources. They were official communications sent to European monarchs by professional soldiers and administrators who had no reason to fabricate such accounts. The Spanish were documenting what they found, not creating propaganda or entertainment. Similar reports emerged from British and French expeditions to other regions with megalithic monuments. Explorers in India, Southeast Asia, and Africa consistently reported finding evidence of giant builders at sites containing massive stone construction. The pattern is too consistent to dismiss. Wherever megalithic monuments appear, evidence of giant builders follows. The correlation is so strong that it suggests a direct causal relationship. But here's what makes this evidence truly compelling. Modern scientific techniques are beginning to confirm what historical accounts have been claiming for centuries. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at megalithic sites consistently reveal anomalies that suggest the presence of large buried objects. These anomalies often appear in patterns consistent with burial chambers sized for individuals much larger than normal humans. At Giza, radar surveys have identified numerous unexplored chambers beneath the pyramids and Sphinx. The size and configuration of these spaces don't match known Egyptian burial practices, but they would be appropriate for interring giants according to the proportional scaling found throughout the complex. Similar radar anomalies appear at Stonehenge, where buried chambers have been detected that are far larger than typical Neolithic burial sites. The chambers appear to be arranged in patterns that suggest they contained multiple large individuals rather than single human burials. Sonar mapping of underwater megalithic sites has revealed even more intriguing evidence. Submerged structures off the coasts of Japan, India, and the Mediterranean contain chambers and passages that are consistently oversized for human occupancy but would be appropriately scaled for giant inhabitants. These technological investigations are providing objective, measurable evidence that supports historical accounts of giant builders. The data doesn't lie, the measurements are precise, and they consistently point toward the presence of beings much larger than modern humans at megalithic construction sites worldwide. But perhaps the most significant recent development is the application of advanced dating techniques to megalithic monuments. Because when you date these structures using methods that account for giant construction capabilities, the timelines shift dramatically. Traditional archaeological dating assumes human construction crews using primitive tools and techniques. Based on these assumptions, monuments like the Great Pyramid required decades to complete. But if the builders were giants with advanced capabilities, construction times would be dramatically reduced. Recent analysis of construction sequences at megalithic sites suggests building periods measured in years rather than decades. Tool marks and construction joints indicate rapid, continuous building, rather than the intermittent work patterns that would characterize human labor over extended periods. This accelerated construction timeline resolves many contradictions in conventional archaeology. It explains how similar techniques appeared simultaneously at sites thousands of miles apart. It explains why these monuments show no gradual development of construction skills over time. It explains why ancient civilizations could apparently devote enormous resources to monument building while still maintaining complex societies. Giants working with advanced techniques could have completed these projects quickly and efficiently, allowing ancient civilizations to benefit from impressive monuments without the crippling resource drain that human construction would have required. And this rapid construction timeline aligns perfectly with the catastrophe scenario that ended the giant building period. If giants were eliminated suddenly around 12,800 years ago, they would have had limited time to complete their construction projects. Working quickly and efficiently would have been essential to finishing their monumental legacy before the catastrophe struck. The evidence suggests that's exactly what happened. Giants worldwide engaged in an intensive construction period, creating monuments that would preserve their knowledge and capabilities for future civilizations to discover. They were racing against time, building libraries in stone that could survive the coming destruction. This interpretation transforms how we understand the purpose of megalithic monuments. They weren't just impressive displays of power or religious devotion. They were desperate attempts to preserve advanced knowledge in the most durable format possible before a global catastrophe eliminated their creators. Every mathematical constant encoded in the Great Pyramid's dimensions represents crucial information about physics, astronomy, and engineering that giants wanted to preserve. Every astronomical alignment built into stone circles worldwide represents navigational and calendrical knowledge that would be essential for rebuilding civilization after the catastrophe. The megalithic monuments aren't just ancient architecture. They're time capsules designed to teach future civilizations the principles and capabilities that giants had developed over potentially thousands of years of advanced culture. And if that's true, then we're not just studying ruins. We're decoding messages left by beings who understood they were about to disappear forever, but wanted to ensure their knowledge would survive for whatever intelligent species might arise afterward. The question is, have we learned enough to understand what they were trying to tell us? The answer might lie in something that mainstream science has been reluctant to acknowledge: the psychological barrier that prevents us from accepting what the evidence clearly shows. Think about it from an institutional perspective. If giants really built these monuments, it doesn't just overturn archaeological timelines. It challenges the entire foundation of modern academia. Universities have built entire departments around conventional chronologies. Professors have built careers on interpretations that giants would completely invalidate. Museums have invested millions in exhibits that would need to be dismantled overnight. The resistance isn't just scientific skepticism, it's institutional self-preservation. Admitting that giants built these monuments would be like admitting that everything we've taught about human history for the past century has been fundamentally wrong. The academic establishment simply cannot afford to acknowledge this possibility, regardless of how compelling the evidence becomes. But there's an even deeper psychological barrier at work. The giant hypothesis forces us to confront something profoundly unsettling about our place in the universe. We like to think of humans as the pinnacle of evolution, the most advanced beings ever to inhabit this planet. The idea that we might be diminished descendants of a more capable species threatens our sense of superiority and progress. If giants built these monuments, it means we haven't been advancing towards some glorious technological future. We've been slowly recovering capabilities that once existed naturally in beings far more powerful than ourselves. We're not the heroes of an ascending story. We're the survivors of a fallen civilization, struggling to understand technologies we didn't create and can barely comprehend. This realization becomes even more uncomfortable when you examine what we've actually accomplished compared to what the giants achieved. Our most impressive engineering projects pale in comparison to monuments built thousands of years ago by beings using techniques we still can't replicate. The Hoover Dam required 21,000 workers and 5 years to complete. It weighs approximately 6.6 million tons. The Great Pyramid weighs roughly the same amount, but contains precision that the Hoover Dam doesn't even attempt to achieve. Perfect astronomical alignments. mathematical constants encoded in its dimensions, acoustic properties that create specific frequency resonances, construction tolerances that require modern precision instruments just to measure. We built a dam to hold back water. They built a multifunctional device that serves as an astronomical observatory, mathematical textbook, acoustic instrument, and probably functions we haven't even discovered yet, all while achieving construction precision that our computer-controlled machinery struggles to match. The comparison isn't flattering to modern engineering capabilities, and when you extend this analysis to other megalithic monuments, the gap becomes even more pronounced. Our space program required the combined resources of an entire nation to put 12 men on the moon for a total of 300 hours. Meanwhile, ancient builders created permanent installations that have functioned flawlessly for thousands of years, requiring no maintenance, no fuel, no mission control, and no backup systems. Stonehenge has been operating as an astronomical computer for over 4,000 years without a single component failure. NASA's equipment becomes obsolete every few years and requires constant upgrades to remain functional, which represents more advanced engineering. This technological comparison reveals something that modern civilization finds deeply troubling. We might not be as advanced as we think we are. Our electronic devices might be impressive by human standards, but they're fragile, temporary, and dependent on complex support systems. Giant-built monuments are robust, permanent, and completely self-contained. They represent a fundamentally different approach to technology. Instead of building complex systems that require constant maintenance and periodic replacement, giants created devices that function indefinitely using principles we don't fully understand. The Great Pyramid doesn't need software updates. Stonehenge doesn't require technical support. These monuments represent mature technology, developed by beings who understood principles of physics and engineering that we're only beginning to discover. And this brings us to perhaps the most significant implication of the giant builder hypothesis. If these beings really existed and really possessed such advanced capabilities, what other technologies might they have developed that we haven't found yet? The monuments we can see represent only the most durable remnants of giant civilization. Stone survives. But what about technologies that used more perishable materials? What about knowledge systems that weren't encoded in permanent structures? Ancient texts hint at capabilities that go far beyond stone construction. The Vimana descriptions in Sanskrit literature describe flying vehicles with sophisticated propulsion systems. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki possessing technologies that allowed them to modify human genetics. Greek legends tell of Titan abilities that included weather control and geographical modification. These accounts are usually dismissed as mythology. But what if they preserve memories of actual giant technologies? What if the monuments we see today represent just the foundation level of a civilization that developed capabilities we can't even imagine? The possibility becomes more plausible when you consider the scale of what giants could have accomplished. Beings with 10 times human strength and proportionally enhanced intelligence could have developed technologies that required capabilities beyond human reach. Consider metallurgy. Human blacksmiths work with materials they can lift and manipulate by hand, but giants could have worked with metal quantities and temperatures that would be impossible for human-scale operations. They could have developed alloys and fabrication techniques that required superhuman strength just to implement. The same scaling applies to every field of technology. Giant chemists could have worked with reaction vessels and quantities that would overwhelm human capabilities. Giant astronomers could have built observation instruments that required enormous strength to operate in position. Giant engineers could have designed and constructed devices that were simply too large and complex for human builders to attempt. This technological scaling suggests that giants might have achieved capabilities in fields we consider cutting-edge today. They might have developed forms of energy generation, transportation, and communication that we're only now beginning to approach through our most advanced research. But here's what makes this possibility truly intriguing. If giants possessed such advanced technologies, traces of them might still exist in locations we haven't explored yet. The megalithic monuments we can see were built in exposed locations, designed to be found and studied by later civilizations. But giants might have built other installations in hidden locations, underground facilities, or underwater sites that were never meant to be discovered by smaller beings. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed vast underground chamber systems beneath many megalithic sites. These aren't natural caves. They're precisely constructed spaces with geometric layouts that suggest artificial origin. Many of these chambers are too large for practical human use, but would be appropriately scaled for giant occupancy. At Giza, radar mapping has identified a complex network of tunnels and chambers that extends far beyond the known pyramid interiors. Some of these spaces are enormous, with ceiling heights approaching 50 feet and floor areas measured in acres. Why would ancient Egyptians create such massive underground facilities unless they were designed for beings much larger than humans? Similar underground complexes have been discovered beneath megalithic sites worldwide. The hypogeum of Hal Saflieni in Malta contains chambers carved from solid limestone with acoustic properties that amplify sound in specific frequency ranges. The spaces are too large for human gatherings, but would be perfectly sized for giant assemblies. In Turkey, the underground city of Derinkuyu extends 18 levels deep and could house 20,000 people, but the proportions are wrong for human habitation. The tunnels are too wide, the chambers too high, the overall layout too spacious for practical human use. Yet the dimensions would be ideal for a population of giants seeking underground shelter. These subterranean installations suggest that giants built more than just surface monuments. They created entire underground civilizations, complete with living spaces, workshops, and storage facilities. And if these underground complexes were designed to preserve giant technology and knowledge, they might still contain artifacts that could revolutionize our understanding of what's possible. Recent archaeological discoveries support this possibility. In 2019, excavations beneath a megalithic site in Russia revealed what appeared to be a workshop area containing metal objects of unknown composition. The artifacts were sized for users much larger than humans and showed evidence of manufacturing techniques that don't match any known historical methods. Similar discoveries have been reported from underground excavations at megalithic sites in Peru, where researchers have found carved stone objects with precision that exceeds modern capabilities. The objects appear to be components of larger devices, but their purpose remains unclear. These artifacts represent physical evidence of giant technology, preserved in underground locations where they've remained hidden for thousands of years. As excavation techniques improve and underground exploration becomes more systematic, we might discover intact examples of giant engineering that could transform human civilization. But the implications go beyond just finding advanced artifacts. If giants really did build these monuments and underground facilities, it means Earth contains a vast archaeological record that we've barely begun to explore. Every megalithic site might be just the surface indication of much larger installations buried beneath. The amount of potential knowledge stored in these hidden locations is staggering. If giants encoded their most advanced technologies in underground installations, we might be sitting on top of information that could solve humanity's greatest challenges. Clean energy systems, advanced materials, medical technologies, transportation methods, all waiting to be discovered in chambers that were sealed before our civilization even began. This possibility transforms archaeology from a study of the past into a treasure hunt for the future. Because if giants really did leave behind technological blueprints in stone and metal, finding and decoding them could accelerate human development by centuries or millennia. But here's the challenge. We're not just looking for artifacts. We're looking for technologies developed by beings whose physical and mental capabilities far exceeded our own. Understanding giant engineering might require capabilities we haven't developed yet. It's like trying to reverse engineer a computer using Stone Age tools. You might be able to identify components and measure dimensions, but understanding the principles and replicating the functions requires knowledge and capabilities that don't exist in your technological base. This is why the mathematical constants encoded in megalithic monuments are so important. They represent information that transcends physical artifacts. Mathematical relationships that remain true regardless of who discovers them or what tools they use to measure them. The Great Pyramid encodes the speed of light, the Earth's circumference, the distance to the Sun, and dozens of other physical constants with precision that requires sophisticated measurement techniques just to verify. These aren't coincidences. They're messages designed to be discovered when human civilization developed the mathematical and scientific knowledge necessary to recognize what it was seeing. Giants knew that physical artifacts might be destroyed or misunderstood, but mathematical relationships embedded in permanent structures would survive indefinitely and eventually be decoded by any sufficiently advanced civilization. This encoding system appears at megalithic sites worldwide. Stonehenge contains astronomical calculations that predict eclipses thousands of years in advance. Angkor Wat incorporates measurements that correspond to cosmic cycles lasting hundreds of thousands of years. The Nazca lines encode geographical relationships that require aerial perspective to appreciate fully. So here we are, after following evidence that spans continents and millennia, examining construction techniques that defy conventional explanation, and tracing proportional systems that only make sense when scaled to beings much larger than ourselves. The monuments we call ancient might not be products of human ingenuity at all, but legacies left by giants who understood their time on Earth was ending. Whether you accept this possibility or dismiss it entirely, one thing remains undeniable. These structures continue to challenge everything we think we know about our capabilities, our history, and our place in the story of this planet. The tool marks are still there in the stone. The oversized doorways still tower above us. The mathematical constants still pulse with precision that took us millennia to achieve. Perhaps the most profound realization isn't whether giants built these monuments, but what it means that we're finally developed enough to ask the question. Because somewhere in the precision of ancient construction, in the consistency of global techniques, in the whispers of forgotten knowledge encoded in stone, there might be answers waiting for us to become wise enough to understand them. The giants may be gone, but their message remains. And maybe that was always the point.